One of my favorite things in the world to do is watch Friends. I know it's been off for years and years. It's not even around, but I still find myself binge watching old episodes. And I was thinking about this today and thinking, it's the predictability of the friends in the circle, right? You have Chandler with his quirkiness, Monica with her type A of just everything has to be so neat and tidy and organized. It's Phoebe's ability to make you laugh at her silly songs. Ross always comes in with those smart comments, and Joey and him and his food, like it is just so hilarious. And of course, Rachel, she just brings everybody together, and it's just such this beautiful, cohesive team of people. And it's why I wanted to come on and share with you today that I have an opportunity for you to find your friends in the content creation space. So if you are thinking about creating your first or your next digital course, I don't want you to miss this opportunity because Amy Porterfield just opened the doors for registration for her Course Confident Bootcamp. And I'm actually offering a special bonus for anyone that registers for the Course Confident Bootcamp through my special link. So I want you to go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register. That's crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And what you're going to find when you get there is I have this special bonus private podcast series. It's called Money Mindset for Creators. So I want you to go register for Amy's bootcamp, download the podcast, and immediately start listening to it, because what this training is set up to do is to help you get your mind right about monetizing your content, making money so that you can fuel your content creation dreams. So go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register for Course Confident. And I cannot wait for you to find your friends and find the people that will be there for you. Do you see what I did there? Yeah, nice little friends segue connection. Go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And I cannot wait to see you inside. Okay, let's get into today's episode. So I get asked a lot about formatting a podcast episode. And is there a difference between how you format a solo podcast or an interview episode? So I'm going to cover all of the things today that have to do with formatting, because it's a question that I see really often, and I just want to break everything down for you and show you that it's a really simple process. And once you have the format of your podcast figured out, it is a lot easier to record. It's a lot easier to plan, and it's super easy to edit once you have all of your podcast format like squared away and you know exactly what you're doing every single week. So let's get right on to it. Have you been wanting to start a podcast? You've been thinking about it. It feels right. You just know this is the next thing that my business needs. Well, I encourage you to sign up for my 5-day podcast bootcamp. This is a thing that you have been looking for. It is a 5-day video series where I walk you through exactly how to start, launch, and market your podcast. And I throw in some more information about planning strategies and being consistent and how you can make the most out of your podcast from day one. So sign up for our 5-day Create Your Podcast Bootcamp at crystalprofit.com/podcast bootcamp. And do it already. You know that you've been wanting to, so just bite the bullet and join us. Welcome to the Profit Podcast, where we teach entrepreneurs how to start, launch, and market their podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Profit, and I'm so excited that you're here. Thanks for hanging out with me today. Because if you've been thinking about creating a podcast for a while, well, I'm so glad you found this show. Think of this as the shortcut / time-saving version of searching Google and YouTube for hours and hours trying to figure out the world of podcasting. Trust me, as a busy mama of 3, I get it. You don't have a lot of time to be spent or wasted, I should say, searching the web, trying to find all the right ideas and all the amazing things that are out there, and you just end up overwhelmed. Trust me, I've been there, done that, took home the souvenir. But this podcast is going to help you in practical ways because twice a week we'll be delivering episodes that are going to give you steps to help you create a podcast your audience can't wait to listen to. So let's get right to it, shall we? So like I said in the beginning, there are two different types of podcast. You can have your solo episodes or you can have interviews. And for this podcast, the Profit Podcast, I like to do a combination of the two because honestly, I just like to have margin in my schedule. Because if I were doing an interview only show, then my podcast is dependent on things that I necessarily can't control. Like what happens if there is a schedule conflict? Because that happens, guys. Like schedule conflicts happen all the time because life happens, stuff comes up. Then I still have control of my calendar, even if an interview falls through. But even though there are technically two different types of podcast, they are formatted the exact same way because each one has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Just like when you were a kid in elementary writing class, right? Like think back to the days where you're sitting in class and the teacher's up there at the front saying, okay, you're going to have your introduction, your main body, and the conclusion. You can hear it all, right? Like can everybody name their elementary school teacher that taught you how to write? I know. I'm not going to say it because I come from a small town and she may be listening or people that listen to her. So shout out elementary writing teachers because y'all are amazing. But you learned that a story needed to have a beginning, a middle, and end. And so does your podcast. So let's break it down into how to format your podcast and what goes into each section of the episode. So the first thing I want to talk about is the beginning, or what we in the podcasting world like to call the intro. Now, I also get questions about time, like how long does each section of your podcast need to be? This totally depends on the length of your show, but for my introduction, the actual introduction for this episode was right under a minute, but I've done intros anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes. I think it just depends on what all information you're trying to put into the introduction. But yeah, 30 seconds to a minute is how long my introductions normally are. So this is the very beginning of your podcast, and the introduction is your first impression and a chance for you to really grab your listeners' attention like immediately, because as soon as they turn on your show, like this is your opportunity, right? If they've never listened to you before, of course your average listeners are going to keep coming back and maybe they're going to hear the same type of content at the beginning. But let's pretend like you are trying to attract a brand new listener. This is your first impression. So depending on your target listener, it may mean that you need to put in some upbeat music and a happy tune to get them really excited about what they're about to experience. Because for the record, there are so many podcasts that I listen to and I totally dance to their music. Like this is definitely a lucrative way to get your audience pumped up about what they are about to experience. There is the Chris Hogan show. I think that's what it's called. I think it used to be Retire Inspired, but it's Chris Hogan's podcast from the Dave Ramsey organization, who is amazing. And I've met him in person. He signed my book, Everyday Millionaire. So if you have not read that, it is awesome. Chris is awesome if you need to know about retirement stuff. But anyway, I remember listening to his podcast, and I want to say he has the music from the Ex-Ambassadors. I think they're the ones that sing that song, but it's like this almost like hardcore rock music, and it has these drums in it. I remember thinking back to a few years ago, I would really just binge listen to a lot of his content when I would go running. And it would just motivate the crap out of me while I'm running. I was like, yeah, he's about to tell me about retirement. I mean, come on, guys. Like, retirement's normally not a, hey, I'm pumped up, I'm motivated to learn about retirement and 401ks and, all these other things. But, it worked for me. I always looked forward to hearing his music. So just know that music is a great way to, kind of draw your audience in. But I wanted to share with you the exact format of my podcast from beginning to end and how I time everything within each episode. So you know how I do this. And if you want to see like visually how all of this plays out, then you can go to crystalprofit.com/episode 82 and you can see everything that I'm talking about today. So let's talk about the intro. What are you going to put within your intro, right? Like within that first 30 seconds to 2 minutes. We'll just call it 2 minutes because there's a few other things I want to add in that are technically part of the intro. But the hook, right? That's your attention grabbing first few seconds of your podcast. So this could be music. It could be a question, like something really attention grabbing, like the very beginning of this episode. I mentioned something about, I get asked a lot about formatting. And so, right off the bat, oh, that's what this is about. She's about to tell me about how to format a podcast. Or you could tell a story about someone who was impacted by something that is very relevant to your podcast, to your industry, to your business, to whatever it is that you're promoting on your podcast. Like those attention-grabbing stories or remarks or facts. Actually, I listened to a podcast recently that was the Simple Pin podcast, which is by Kate All, and she teaches all about Pinterest marketing. And oh, this was so good. And like, I need to send her a note and tell her that this worked so well on me. But she had an episode of her podcast titled 1 billion views for her members or for her, for all the people that she's helped. It's been over 1 billion impressions. That's what it was. Because I remember she was saying impressions really don't mean like that much if they don't convert to, something else down the road. But anyway, oh my gosh, I don't even want to get started on Pinterest because I will talk about it forever. I love Pinterest. But that 1 billion remark, like that totally, like my ears perked up. I remember I was getting ready when I listened to it and I just kind of stopped what I was doing because I was thinking, oh my gosh, what does she talk? A billion what? What does that mean? And so that was her hook. That's how she got me drawn into the episode. I was paying closer attention to what she was saying because I was super interested in that 1 billion impressions remark and I wanted to learn more. So the hook is one thing to have within your introduction. The next thing is the podcast main theme. So this is what I call, this is the pre-formatted, pre-recorded audio that I put into every single episode of my podcast. You could say this each time if you wanted, but I just find it easier to automate this part of my editing whenever you have certain things pre-recorded. Like what you hear in this podcast, I recorded a while back and I just drop that audio file into each episode whenever I'm editing. And I think I'm going to do an episode pretty soon about how to automate other sections of your podcast. But just know that I think that you should have something that tells your listeners each time exactly who your podcast is for, what you talk about, and you could even put on what days you publish. That way, if it's a brand new listener, they can know when to tune in. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about for the intro is your self-sponsored ads. And I know I'm going to do an entire episode and probably a few YouTube videos on this because people have been asking me, like, what the heck is a self-sponsored ad? What is... I don't even, how do you create it? How do you do it? But just for today, just know that this is a promotional piece for your podcast, and it's just like any other ad, but it's where you promote your own thing. Like this could be a lead magnet to grow your list, someone join your Facebook group, sell a product, sign up for a service, like all the things. It's similar to a call to action, but it's formatted in just a slightly different way. So let me just recap. So within the intro, right, the first few seconds, few minutes of your podcast, I want you to include a hook, your main podcast theme, and a self-sponsored ad. Okay, so moving on. We covered the beginning of your podcast. Now we're going to talk about the middle. Now, for time-wise, like I said, depending on your podcast, this could be anywhere from 20 minutes to 50 minutes, depending on, how long your show is. So this is where things really start to differ on whether it is a solo show or an interview episode. And here are the main things that I want you to see in how you format each episode type. So for the solo podcast, the middle of the episode is the meat. So going back to the writing in elementary school, like that, you're imagining you're sitting in class and Mrs. Franklin, we'll call her, she's standing up there and she's like, okay, kids, we're going to talk about the main body now. These are the main points that you want your readers to take away. This is the meat of the story. So this is where you're going to explain whatever it is that you're talking about for that particular episode. And I found that it works best to plan and format your episodes to almost like tell a story. Like even within the middle, you want your content to be structured so people can follow along with what you're saying. So in other words, you don't want to be all over the place where no one can follow what you're talking about. You want to make it easy to understand, easy to follow. I know things like numbers and bullet points within your outline can help you stay organized and help make sure that you cover everything you want to talk about in each episode. Y'all, trust me, I've listened to so many podcasts now, and I've listened to multiple ones that I only listened to once, and it's because the host is just so spacey. There's not really a lot of structure to what they're saying. They either go on tangents and they start rambling about this or about that, and there's no focused topic that they're speaking on. So I stopped listening. Stop listening. I can't handle it. I like organization and I like everything. So if you can format your outline, and this doesn't have to be scripted, you don't have to script your entire podcast, but I have found that a really detailed outline has helped me stay on topic, make sure I cover all the major points I want to cover, and then move on. Not add in too much fluff. Like, we just want very straightforward, tactical things here on this podcast. So that is how you structure or format a solo podcast in the middle. Now, if you're doing an interview, this is where things get a little bit different.
Being a woman in business comes with its own unique set of challenges, but also so many opportunities. We get ahead by leaning in to what makes us different from business as usual. I'm Samantha Hartley, host of Profitable Joyful Consulting, inviting you to a special 6-episode series exploring the experience of being a woman in business. You want to hear from women consultants who've hit $1 million, who sell 6-figure engagements, or who've broken their own revenue ceilings? Yeah, those are my clients, and they'll be sharing too. Join me for 6 must-listen episodes that tackle key challenges for women consultants.
Follow Profitable Joyful Consulting on your favorite podcast app.
So in the middle of an interview episode, the first thing I want you to do is kind of set the mood, set the stage for what your listeners are about to experience. So the first few minutes after your introduction should be dedicated to setting the stage for your audience to listen to an interview. And there are a few ways to do this. You could tell a short story about how you met your guest, how long you've known them. You could read the guest bio that they sent to you before your interview, or you could just list out their qualifications for the topic that you're speaking on. So I know a lot of my previous guests, I kind of share like, oh, we met in this Facebook group. This is who she is. This is what she does. And this is how she's going to help us today. So I want to make sure that you really set the stage and you get your audience excited about what they're about to experience, what's about to go down, what's about to happen, because you know that you had an amazing interview with this person and you just really want to set the stage. That way your audience hangs out and then they keep coming back for more content every week. So there isn't a right way or a wrong way to do this, but I think it's important that you give your guest a proper introduction before you dive into the interview. And just a quick note, I've had a few people ask me before, do you record the guest information before or after you actually interview them? And for my editing schedule, I normally conduct the interview and then I will go back and record their bio, or I will, tell the story about how we met or something like that. But I like to do that after the interview only because it's easier for me to prompt the audience on what they're going to take away from this specific episode. I hope that makes sense. So I record all of the pre-interview. I guess it's not pre-interview. It's post-interview recorded, but it's pre-interview. It's before, the listeners actually hear the interview. So I hope that makes sense. Send me questions if that didn't. But like I said, you can go to the show notes and see, because I'm stepping out exactly how all of this is done on the show notes. So after you have set the stage in the middle of the podcast format, then you're going to have the actual interview. And this is exactly how it sounds, is the actual podcast interview that you had with your guest. So you would just drop that in the editing process, or you would make sure that you had like a place marker in your outline for the actual interview that you conducted. And then the last thing we're going to talk about today is the outro. So if we go back to our illustration, we're sitting in writing class and Miss Franklin is standing up there saying, "Okay, kids, now it's time for the conclusion," because you can't just walk away from the story without it being completed. So my outros, depending on the episode, these aren't always the same, but these can be between 1 to 5 minutes long, again, depending on the length of your podcast and whether you want to give the listeners a summary, or you want to have calls to action, or you want to add another self-sponsored ad or music or whatever. There's a lot of variations that can go into the outro, but the most important thing I want you to remember is to wrap it up. I want you to, just like our writing teachers taught us, we need to end the story properly. So I know I've talked about Donald Miller before because I'm obsessed with all things StoryBrand. So if you have not read the book StoryBrand, you should go grab it and read it, because no matter what it is that you do, I promise you it can help you in your business and your life. And it's such a great read, and the way that he lays out everything in a framework, it's just so easy to follow, and there's a lot of really cool online resources. But he talks about closing story loops all of the time, and that we need to practice this in our marketing. So have you ever listened to a podcast or watched a movie or read a book and thought, that's it? That's the end of the story? Well, what about the farmer's daughter that was left at the gas station, or the airplane that went up in the air but never landed, or the topic she started talking about but never came back to? I know that you've experienced this too, right? Like where you're just like, that what? Like, you feel confused, right? You feel so like, it's like you were shortchanged. Like, what happened? Like, I don't even understand. So we have to make sure that we close all of the story loops that we open in our podcast episode. So the outro is where you want to do this. You don't want to just simply quit talking and play your music. Listeners will be confused about whether or not the episode was actually finished, or they may think that you're a little too messy in your editing for their listening pleasure, and they might not come back next week. And we don't want that to happen, okay? We don't want them to walk away and think like, well, she didn't even finish the episode, or she had a malfunction, or she's not, legit when it comes to podcasting. So I'm not even going to do it. So there are a few ways to wrap it up, and I mentioned these a second ago, but the first is doing a simple recap or a summary. Go back and give like a high-level overview of everything that you covered in the episode. So if this was an interview, you could go back and just share some of the highlights of your interview. Or if it's a solo podcast and you have bullet points, then just go back through and say, we covered topics 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's what we covered today. So that's one of the things you could do. You can do a recap or a summary. Or you could just say, well, that does it for this episode, because it cues the audience that it's curtain call, right? Like that your time together is coming to an end. And if that sounds familiar, it's because I do it a lot in this episode or in this podcast, because it just feels right. It feels like, okay, like this is close. Our time together is coming to an end. So just be prepared that you're going to hear the music here in a few minutes. So, but another way to wrap it up is you can throw in some calls to action that you didn't want to throw at them at the very beginning or the middle of an episode. So I know that some people prefer to leave their calls to action until the very end, but some people want to make sure that listeners they don't have to listen all the way to the very end, so they throw them in at the very beginning. Like, I'm good either way, as long as you have some calls to action within your podcast episode. I don't care where you put them, but I have found that if you're unsure where to put your calls to action, it's easy to slip them into the outro. It feels natural to say, okay, that does it for this episode. Be sure you subscribe to the show, or be sure you leave a review, or whatever it is that you want them to do. But and it doesn't matter if you have a solo podcast or you do interview episodes, you need to have calls to action no matter what. Okay, another way to wrap it up is to tell your audience where they can find the show notes for this episode. So I normally do this at the very end is, be sure to check out the show notes at crystalprofit.com/episode 82, and then just say the URL. That's all you have to make sure that you do is tell them exactly where they can find the show notes. And then the last thing you can do to wrap it up is just throw in your tagline and some music to officially walk them out of the door. Like that, just like the gracious host that you are. You're saying, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. I will see you next week and see you later. Bye-bye. Like that's what the music kind of does. If you have music at the end or your tagline, you're just kind of walking them out the door like the gracious host that you are. So I wanted to say another, a few notes. Feel free to add the music or calls to action, your tagline, self-sponsored ads anywhere within the podcast episode. I wanted to make that really clear that it's not cut and dry that you have to have it within a certain part, but I simply put them in my show because that's how I like to format them. That's how it works for me. It flows really well. It's easy for me to talk about things in a specific order, but feel free to play around with the podcast format and what's going to work best for you and your audience. And that's it. That does it for this episode. You see what I did there? Now you know. Okay, something's coming. We're coming to a close. But let me know if you have any other questions about how to format a podcast. I actually did a full YouTube video on this, and I'll link to that in the show notes. So if you're a visual person and you want to see how I break everything down, you can check that out. It'll be in the show notes, but I just want to do a quick recap of everything that we talked about because I am practicing what I preach, right? So I told you, okay, that does it for this episode. I'm wrapping it up. Now I'm going to give you the recap. So the things that we talked about today were the two different types of podcasts. You could have a solo or an interview, and this format applies to either one. Then the next thing we talked about the intro, and then the middle of your podcast, which is either your interview or the meat of your episode. And then the fourth thing we talked about was your outro. And the fifth thing we talked about was just remember to put calls to action, your music, your self-sponsored ads, wherever you want to within your episode. But at the very, very minimum, you need to have calls to action within your podcast. But that does it for today. So if this is your first time tuning in, I'd love for you to subscribe to the show and hear what other fun things we'll be talking about in the coming weeks. And I would love for you to leave us a review. Tell us what your favorite podcast episode has been, or tell us what you've learned since you've been listening to the podcast, or tell me what other topics you want to hear us talk about, because I have a ton of awesome ideas, but I want to know specifically how I can help you out. Be sure to sign up for the 5-day free podcast bootcamp, where you're going to learn what you need to know for starting, launching, and marketing your podcast. Check out the other great resources we have in the resource library, and you can find all of this at crystalprofit.com/episode 82. But remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere. Hey, Profit Podcast listeners. Thanks for sticking around to a little bit after the episode to hear this special message, because I want to hear from you. We are starting a new segment called Fan Mail Shoutouts, and I want to hear from you, and I want to hear your questions. What do you want to know? What questions have you been dying to ask me? So here's how to make this happen. Go to the app where you're listening to this podcast right now. Go there. I'll wait a second. Okay. Now, once you're there, you're going to see a hyperlink at the top of the episode description that says, "Send Crystal a text message." And that's all I want you to do. Send me a text. It could be casual, informal. It could be totally anonymous. Or if you want, you can include your name and the name of your podcast or content wherever you are creating, and I will give you a special shout out in an upcoming episode. So again, go to the show notes for where you're listening to this episode right now, and it will say, "Send Crystal a text message." And I cannot wait to hear from you and give you a shout out in an upcoming segment of Fan Mail Shoutouts.